I'll introduce you, speak for about half an hour, 35 minutes, and then we'll have a question and
I'll
answer.
speak from the podium.
Friends, can I welcome you to the Mansfield series. My name is Helena Kennedy, and I'm the principal here at Mansfield College. And it's my real delight to welcome here tonight one of my heroes. Bill Browder is a great human rights activist. It didn't start that way, it's fair to say, and I've got to tell you a little bit about his past in order to understand his present. Bill Browder was the founder and the chief executive of Hermitage Capital Management, which was the investment advisor to the largest foreign investment fund in Russia, and he started doing that when was it? Well, when Russia basically became Russia as we now know it. I suppose it was the early 90s, was it?
Yeah.
And he held that position there until 2005, and then suddenly was denied entry to Russia and declared a threat to national security. And it was really as a result of his own battle with corporate corruption and with the Putin regime. So following his expulsion, the Russian authorities raided his offices. They seized Hermitage Funds, investment companies, and used them to steal £230 million of taxes that the companies had previously paid, claiming that they hadn't been paid, but in fact they'd made off with them. And when Bill's lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, investigated the crime, he was arrested by the very same officers who were implicated in the whole scandal. He was tortured for 358 days, and he was killed in custody. He was only 37, and that was in November 2009. That death of Sergei Magnitsky, a young man who was the father of young children and with a lovely wife, and who was a friend to Bill, as well as a professional colleague, and someone who was acting for Bill. That death was absolutely traumatic in the effect it had on Bill and on the people who worked in the company. And since then, Bill has spent the last years fighting for justice for Sergei Magnitsky. The Russian government didn't just exonerate the officials who were involved in the horrors of this, but even promoted some of them. And so Bill basically decided that he had to do something. He couldn't live with the fact that this injustice had taken place. He took the case to America, where his campaigning, and he is an American by birth, but he's now a British citizen, but he took his case to America, where he went to Congress, he went to different sides of the aisle, found support for what he now calls Magnitsky Law. It was the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act, and it was in fact passed by Congress in 2012. And it meant that sanctions were placed on a whole number of people, and there were asset freezes on their properties and on their bank accounts and what they had in America, and they were being refused visas. And it was for all of those who'd been involved in the detention and the ill treatment and the death of Sergei Magnitsky, and responsible basically for the terrible human rights abuses that had taken place. This law was the first time that the US sanctioned Russia in 35 years, and it became the model for all of the subsequent US sanctions against Russia. But Bill had got the bit between his teeth, and he fought strenuously to have that law introduced. He spent time all over Europe. One of my colleagues in Chambers, Jeff Robertson, who's going to be speaking later in this series, was involved, in fact, in trying to get that before the European Parliament. Here in the UK, we've managed to, through cross-party working, different people in different parties working together, have managed to get work done on dealing with assets, using, legislation was going through Parliament and adding amendments to it. I, just before Christmas, introduced a private member's bill in the House of Lords to refuse visas to human rights abusers. And the thing about this is that while it was the death of Sergei that really motored and motivated and ignited this passionate activism in Bill, it's led to a much bigger thing, which is that this kind of law can be used to actually put limits on those who are human rights abusers in many different nations and in many different ways. That the way to get to people is often by sanctioning them over their property rights, over their desire to be able to move freely as between nations and so forth. And so Magnitsky Law has been a powerful tool now in the hands of human rights lawyers. Browder, Bill Browder, is currently having similar legislation. He had it passed in Canada. I met with the parliamentarians who were involved with that. And one of the great things is that he's also set up a thing called the Magnitsky Human Rights Awards, which gives awards to people who are involved in human rights activism, but who also have really fought with their own parliaments to get change made, and in some quite unusual places, which he'll tell you about, no doubt, in the course of his talk. The incredible thing is that for most people, when they experience injustice, it can make you very angry and it can make you want to do things. But often we want to do it, but we aren't able to do it. And it's special people who somehow have the urgency that says, I'm not going to take this lying down. And Bill Browder is one of those people. So we have him with us here tonight, Bill Browder.
So if you were to ask my friends to use one sentence to describe me, the sentence that they would use is that I'm Putin's #1 enemy. Now that may sound self-important, that may sound exaggerated, maybe even ridiculous, but I guarantee you by the time I'm done speaking here in about 35 minutes, you will believe that that is actually the case. Now, how is it that this guy, this average-looking fellow with an American accent, ended up becoming Putin's #1 enemy? And in order to explain it, I've got to go back 2 generations. I am indeed from America. I was born in Princeton, New Jersey. I grew up in Chicago. But I come from a very unusual American family. My grandfather, Earl Browder, was from Wichita, Kansas, and he was a labor union organizer in the 1920s. And he was so good at organizing the labor union that he was spotted by the communists. And they said, if you like labor unionism, you're going to love communism. Why don't you come to Moscow and check it out? So my grandfather Earl, in 1927, moved to Moscow. And when he got to Moscow, he did what most young, single, red-blooded American men do when they get to Moscow. He found a Russian girl who became my grandmother. And then my father was born in Moscow along with 2 brothers. And 5 years later, they moved back to America. And my grandfather then became head of the American Communist Party. He was head of the American Communist Party for 13 years. He ran for president against Franklin Roosevelt in 1936 and 1940. He was imprisoned by Roosevelt in 41, pardoned by Roosevelt in 42. He was then expelled from the Communist Party in 1945 for being too much of a capitalist. But that didn't help him in the 1950s during the McCarthy era, where they persecuted him viciously for being a communist. So this is my family legacy. I was born in 1964. I'm 54 years old. But when I was going through my teenage rebellion, I was trying to figure out a good way of rebelling from this family of communists. I tried several things. I grew my hair long. It's not obvious now, but it grew into an afro. Strangely, that didn't upset my family. I followed the Grateful Dead around. They no longer exist, but a famous rock band around America for a few months. Strangely, that also didn't upset my family. But then I came up with the perfect plan, which was I put on a suit and tie and became a capitalist. And that really did upset them. So I became a capitalist, and I ended up at Stanford Business School to get my MBA in 1987. And I was going through business school, and it's a 2-year program, and I graduated in 1989. And 1989 was a very auspicious year because that was the year that the Berlin Wall came down. And I was, as I was going through my MBA, trying to figure out what I was going to do with my career and my life, I couldn't get excited by all the normal on-campus recruiting events that were coming there. The jobs that my classmates were going to just didn't resonate with me. And I was searching my soul for the right career and the right thing to do after business school. And one day I had this epiphany, which was that if the Berlin Wall has just come down, and my grandfather was the biggest communist in America, I'm going to try to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. And so that's what I set out to do. I moved to London, which was as close as I could get to Eastern Europe at the time. And I had the job that sort of changed my life was a job working at an investment bank called Salomon Brothers. Salomon Brothers, I was on the investment banker on the East European team of Salomon Brothers. And my very first assignment was to advise a fishing fleet located in Murmansk, Russia, which is a couple hundred miles north of the Arctic Circle, on their privatization. And so I get on a plane to Murmansk, and the head of the fishing fleet meets me at the airport, and he says, before we have a business meeting, I'd like to show you one of our ships. And so we drive down to the docks, and I get out of the car, and before me is this enormous, enormous vessel. It's like 300 or 400 feet long, on a number of different stories. On the top story, they have the nets to catch the fish, and then they separate them out on the next story and do various things with them on the next story. And then they have machines, or canning machines, in the bowels of the ships where they actually can the fish into the cans. And so it's effectively an ocean-going factory. And it's very impressive. And I asked him, how much does one of these things cost? And he said they cost $20 million. And then I asked him, how many of these ships do you have in your fleet? And he said, there's 100. So I did the math, 20 million times 100, and that gets you to 2 billion. And I should point out that I didn't know a lot about ships or fishing, and I still don't know a lot about ships or fishing. But I asked him, how old is your fleet? And he said, it's 7 years old on average. And so I did the math, and I said to myself, okay, $2 billion worth of ships when they bought them, 7 years old, maybe $1 billion worth of ships now. And I'd been hired by this company to advise the management on whether or not they should exercise their legitimate right under the privatization program of Russia to buy 51% of the company. And so I asked him, at what price is the government selling you 51%? And he said, $2.5 million. So let me just repeat the math for you. There's $1 billion worth of ships, and the management can buy 51% for $2.5 million. Well, you don't have to be a financial genius to know that that's a good deal, and so I obviously advised them to exercise their right under the privatization program and buy that. But moreover, I thought to myself, I really shouldn't be an advisor on this stuff. I should be investing in this stuff, and so I. Instead of going back to London, I decided to go to Moscow and figure out whether this is some anomaly in the fishing industry or whether this is something going on more widespread. So I get to Moscow, and I'm at the airport, and I notice as I'm going through the airport, they have they have a kiosk, and in the kiosk they're selling a very thin English language yellow page directory. And I don't know anybody in Russia, and I didn't speak Russian, and so I decided I was going to buy this English language yellow page directory and just cold call people the next day and see if I can get meetings with people to find out what's going on with the privatization program. So I buy this yellow page directory, I go to my hotel, the next morning I start calling people, and over the course of the week I have about 40 meetings. And by the end of the week, what I had learned from this 40 meetings was that the Russian privatization program is, and always will be, the single most compelling investment opportunity that's ever existed in the history of financial markets. And effectively what the Russian government had done in the early 1990s was they decided to become capitalist from communist. And they said the best way of making this transition from communism to capitalism is to create capitalists by giving people property. And they said the best way to do that is just to give everything away for free from the state. And so they came up with a number of different schemes to do this, and the scheme that I learned about was called the voucher privatization scheme. And in the voucher privatization scheme, they gave a physical voucher to every person in the country. And the population of the country at the time was 150 million people. And these vouchers were freely tradable privatization certificates. You could buy them, you could sell them, you could burn them, you could give them, you could do anything you wanted with them, no restrictions. And so as a result, a market developed for these vouchers, and they traded for about $20 each. And so again, I just did some simple math. There was $20 for each voucher. There was 150 million people who got them, so it meant there's $3 billion worth of vouchers. And those $3 billion worth of vouchers were exchangeable for 30% of the share capital of all Russian companies, which meant that the market value of the entire country of Russia at the time was $10 billion. And to put this in some perspective for you, this is a country that has 35% of the world's natural gas, 10% of the world's oil, 10% of the world's aluminum, 10% of the world's steel. There's fertilizer, car companies, telephone companies, banks, electricity companies, timber companies, everything. The entire country, $10 billion. At the time, you couldn't buy 20% of Walmart for $10 billion. And here you have the entire country of Russia for $10 billion. And so I go back. I go back to Salomon Brothers, where I'm working in London, and I'm really just out of my mind excited because they're effectively giving free money away on the streets of Russia. And so the first person I see inside the firm, I say, listen, we have to stop everything else we're doing and invest in Russia. And before I had a chance to even explain the math that I've just taken you through, they kind of shut down because what kind of crackpot is talking about investing in Russia? And I didn't have any particular organizational skills to know how to make things happen in a big organization. And so I figured one person said, no, I'm just going to go to another person. And so I went to the next person and said, we got to stop everything we're doing and invest in Russia. And the second person just shut down. And I went through the entire sort of group of people that I knew inside this organization and had completely and utterly discredited myself by the time I was done. And so I discredited myself to such an extent that the young guys who I was in my mid-20s, the guys who I went to lunches and drinks with stopped inviting me to lunches and drinks. And more than that, this was a company that was extremely dog-eat-dog capitalist company. And if you weren't making 5 times what they were paying you, your salary, you were fired. And I wasn't making anywhere near 5 times what they had paid me in my salary for the company. And I was the crazy guy talking about Russia. And so I was on the verge of getting fired. And I was very demoralized because I knew that I had spotted the sort of best economic opportunity there ever was. And not only was I not going to be able to exercise it at Salomon Brothers, I was probably not going to have a job at Salomon Brothers. And so I was very upset with myself and the situation and not knowing what to do and trying to figure out what to do. And one day, as I'm sitting at my desk, my phone rings. I pick it up, and it's a very senior partner in the New York office of Salomon Brothers. And he says, Bill, I hear you're having some career troubles, but you might have something interesting to say about Russia. And I said, yeah. And he said, come to New York, I'd like to hear it. And so I stay up 3 nights in a row putting together the most persuasive PowerPoint presentation I could come up with. I practice it in front of my mirror. I practice it to myself on the airplane. I practice it in my hotel room. And then I go into the meeting. I sit down in this meeting with this guy, and I start taking him through my PowerPoint presentation. And I'm going through the slides, and I'm not getting any feedback from him. He's not nodding. He's not ahhing. He's not asking me any questions. He's just staring at me impassively. And I'm going through the slides, and I get to about page 21, and I don't know how I'm doing, but all of a sudden this guy, without saying a word, gets up, leaves the room, and walks out. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, I thought I had this thing perfectly orchestrated. I thought I had figured it all out, and this guy just left. What have I done? And he's gone for 10 minutes, and he's gone for 20, gone for 30, and I'm thinking to myself, this was my chance to save my career, and I've obviously done something wrong. When he comes back here, I'm gonna write this meeting, and I'm going through my mind of all the different things I can say to him to make this thing all right. And he's gone for 40 minutes, gone for 50 minutes. 52 minutes later, he comes back into the room, and I'm about to blurt out something to try to get this meeting on track, even though I don't know why it's gone off track. But before I have a chance to say anything, he says very calmly to me, he said, "Bill, those slides you just showed me are the single most impressive thing I've ever seen in my investment career. I've just gone to the risk management committee at Salomon Brothers, and I got you $25 million to invest in Russia. Please stop everything else you're doing and invest that money." So all of the cloud has lifted off my shoulders. I'm now in business doing exactly what I wanted to do. I take the $25 million, I go to Moscow, I get the money invested. And then 7 months later, The Economist magazine writes an article called Sale of the Century, in which they describe the same math that I've just shared with you. And as a result of them writing that article, about 20 big international investors decide they want to all buy Russian shares at once, at the same time. And the Russian stock market was a very thinly traded, illiquid little stock market. And all of a sudden, 20 very clumsy international investors all show up at once, all wanting to buy. What did that do to the stock market? It pushed it up over a matter of 3 weeks, 500%. And so my $25 million turned into $125 million literally overnight. And I should point out that this is back in the time when $100 million profit was real money. And all of a sudden I was a hero on the trading floor of Salomon Brothers. The young guys who had stopped inviting me to lunches and drinks were all camped out at my desk first thing in the morning to try to get stock tips on how they could make 5 times their money in the Russian stock market. And then something strange happened. Some older fellows, and I should say older in the world of Salomon Brothers was about 40, would start coming by my desk, and one of them came by and said, I'm so and so. I run the George Soros account here, and I know you're very busy, Bill, and you've got a lot of important things going on. But is there any possibility you could share an hour of your time with George Soros? He'd really appreciate it. And then the guy who covered Sir John Templeton, one of the most famous people in the world of investing, came over and said, "Bill, we realize that your time is precious, but Sir John Templeton would really be so grateful if you could spend some time with him." And then Julian Robertson, Michael Steinhardt, all the sort of gods of royalty of Wall Street all wanted to meet me to hear about what I was doing. And so I get on an airplane and I go on a world tour of the royalty of Wall Street. And they're much smarter than my Salomon colleagues were. And as I go through my presentation with them, at the end of each meeting, each of them says, that's the most remarkable thing I've ever seen. Can we give you some money to manage? And I say, I don't know. We at the moment, we're just managing money for ourselves. But let me go back to the bosses and see if I can get some money, if I can get the permission to manage other people's money. And so I go back to London. I go to the corner office of the trading floor to the big boss, and I say, I've just been with George Soros. He'd like us to manage his money. What do you think? And he said, that's a brilliant idea, Bill. Let's form a task force to study it. So I say, okay. And a week later is our first task force meeting. I walk into a room, and there's 45 people present. 40 of them I've never seen before in my life. There was the vice chairman of the firm, senior managing directors, senior directors, directors, senior vice presidents, and me. I was the most junior person in the room. And so we all sit down, and within seconds of sitting down, a fight breaks out between one of the groups in Salomon Brothers and another one as to who's going to get the economic credit for the business. And then another group pipes in thinking that they deserve the economic credit. And the one thing I can tell you about investment bankers is they're incredibly articulate in arguing for money they don't deserve. And I was watching this multiple, it was like a sort of multi-dimensional tennis as everyone was making these highly persuasive arguments for who should get the economic credit for the business. And I had absolutely no idea who was going to win this argument. But I was 100% sure who wasn't going to get any economic credit for the business, and that was going to be me. And so I was extremely upset because I was the only person in the entire room who knew anything about Russian stocks or had even been to Russia. and all these people were sort of fighting over the carcass of my business. And after 3 days of not being able to sleep, I decided I was going to quit. I walked into the head of the trading floor. I handed in my security badge. I quit. And then I moved to Moscow, and I set up my own investment firm called Hermitage to invest in the Russian stock market. And one of those famous investors gave me $25 million as my anchor investor in my fund. I got started in April of 1996, and my launch of my fund was the single most successful launch of an investment fund in the history of investment funds. Over the next 18 months, my fund went up 850%. I went from $25 million of assets under management to more than $1 billion of assets under management. I was the best performing fund manager in the world in 1997. I was featured in the Financial Times, the New York Times, Business Week, Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine as some type of financial genius. My clients were sending their private jets to Moscow to retrieve me, to take me to the south of France to toast my success on their yachts. And I was all of 31 years old. Now, any of these successes would have been great in their own right. But if you take them and you put them all together, and then you put them all together into the hands of a 31-year-old, in the parlance of Wall Street, that's one of the biggest sell signals there ever was. But because I was 31 years old, I didn't think that could happen. I didn't see how anything was going to happen other than my $1 billion was going to turn into $10 billion. And so I sat it out and kept on looking forward. And in 1998 was a very bad year for the Russian economy and the Russian stock market. In 1998, the Russian government defaulted on their bonds. They devalued their currency by 75%. And out of my $1 billion, I lost $900 million of my clients' money. I went down 90%. Now, as you can imagine, no one was inviting me to their yachts anymore. But more importantly, I had gone around the world explaining to people how they were going to do so well investing with me in Russia, and I'd lost them 90% of their money. And I was deeply ashamed of myself and humiliated by having been such a proponent of Russia and having it go so horribly wrong. I was determined that I was going to make people's money back for them. I was going to go back from 10 cents on the dollar back to $1. And it was the last thing I ever did. And in theory, it shouldn't have been that hard to do because the companies that I was investing in were oil companies and other resource companies. And they all sold their oil and other resources in dollars, and they paid for all of their expenses in rubles. And the ruble had just gone down by 75%. And so if your revenues, if your sales stay the same and your costs go down dramatically, then your profits increase. And so in theory, the profits should have increased, the share prices should have recovered, and I should have been able to make my money back for my clients. That was the theory. However, there was one huge complication, which is that these companies were majority owned by these people called the Russian oligarchs. And the Russian oligarchs are not nice people. And the Russian oligarchs, up until 1998, had kind of behaved themselves because they were told by these fancy guys from Wall Street that if they behaved themselves and didn't scandalize their minority investors and shareholders, that they would be able to go to Wall Street and get free money from Wall Street. And so these guys, on one hand, they love to like steal from people, but on the other hand, they like, maybe they get that free money and then steal afterwards. And so they had kind of restrained themselves up until 1998. But after the Russian government defaulted and devalued and the stock market crashed, nobody wanted to invest on Wall Street whether they were well-behaved or badly behaved. I mean, nobody from Wall Street wanted to invest in Russia whether they were well-behaved or badly behaved. And so that eliminated any incentive for the Russian oligarchs to behave themselves. And because there was no incentive for them to behave themselves, Russia has never had any disincentive against misbehavior. And so as a result, the Russian oligarchs embarked on an orgy of stealing, which has been unprecedented in the history of business. They did asset stripping, transfer pricing, embezzlements, dilutions, and they did it on an industrial scale to a fine art. And there I was sitting with my last 10 cents on the dollar, and they were going to try to steal the last 10 cents on the dollar. And so I decided that I was going to fight them to stop them from stealing. I was going to become a shareholder activist, an anti-corruption activist. And the most famous case that I've been involved in was with Gazprom. Gazprom was a company that traded at a 99.7% discount per barrel of hydrocarbon reserves because everybody thought that everything out of Gazprom had been stolen. And so I decided that I was going to do a stealing analysis of Gazprom and figure out how much was stolen. Now, how do you do a stealing analysis of a Russian company? You can't go into the management and say, "Excuse me, sir, can you tell me how much you're stealing?" Because they won't. Nor can you go to the investment banks that do the research on Gazprom because they're so busy trying to be nice to the management in hopes that some money will flow their way that they'll never say anything bad. And so what I decided to do was to go out and ask people who knew about the stealing. I made a list of ex-employees, customers, suppliers, competitors, anybody who knew about the stealing, and asked them to breakfast, lunch, tea, coffee, dinner, dessert, and see what people would tell me. And I sent out 40 invitations, and 35 people said yes. I didn't tell them my agenda in advance. I just said, "I want to have a meal with you." And people were kind of curious what this American guy wanted to do, having a meal with them, and a lot of them said yes. And I went to my first meeting, and I discovered the most interesting thing, the most interesting cultural anomaly about the Russians, which was that during the Soviet times, the richest Russian was maybe 6 times richer than the poorest Russian. They might have had a bigger apartment, maybe a nice dacha out of town, and a car and a driver, but that was it. By 1999, the richest Russian was 250,000 times richer than the poorest Russian. So over a 10-year period, the wealth disparity exploded like it's never exploded in the history of wealth. And everybody in Russia was furious that they were not participating. And so as a result, when I sat down at my first meeting and I asked about the corruption and the stealing of Gazprom, the guy leant forward and he started telling me the stories like you couldn't imagine. And I had a notebook with me and I started writing down in my notebook and writing down notes and flipping the page and writing more notes. And he just kept on going on and on and on with these unbelievable stories of stealing at Gazprom. 2 hours into it, I had to end the lunch because I had other stuff to do I had to do that day. And the next meeting was exactly the same. And the next meeting after that was exactly the same. And by the end, I filled up 2 full notebooks with the most shocking stories of stealing you could ever imagine at Gazprom. And I was sure I was onto something gigantic. The problem was, I couldn't prove any of it. This was just lunchtime conversations. How would I actually be able to prove any of this stuff? And so without proving it, I couldn't really go to the newspapers. Without proving it, I couldn't go to court. And so all I knew is that there was something dramatically bad going on at Gazprom, but I couldn't prove it. And it was very frustrating because I knew that there was something to be done there. And then about 3 weeks after our last meeting, my head of research, a guy named Vadim, was driving his car through Moscow. And there's a number of places where the traffic snarls up very badly. And one of those places is called Pushkin Square. And the traffic is so bad at Pushkin Square that people sometimes have to sit in their car for half hour or maybe even an hour at a bad day. And as a result, an outdoor market emerged at Pushkin Square of street urchins selling things to trap motorists. And they're selling all sorts of strange stuff. They're selling pornographic DVDs, newspapers, cigarettes, lighters, underwear, all sorts of strange stuff. And if you're stuck there, you're kind of curious to see what people are selling. And so some kid comes to his window and he knocks on the window, he rolls it down, and he says to the kid, "What are you selling?" And the kid said, "Databases." And Vadim said, "What do you mean databases?" And this kid has this sort of dirty down parka. He opens it up, and in the parka, he's got these plastic folders with these discs in them. And Vadim said, "What's that one?" And the kid says, "That's the Moscow Registration Chamber database," which is something that we had been looking for. This is the database that shows the beneficial ownership of all Moscow-based companies. And Vadim said, "Really? How much?" And the kid said, $5. So he pays him $5. He gets the disc. He comes back in the office waving the disc. He says, "Some kid just claimed he sold me the Moscow Registration Chamber database for $5. I said to Vadim, "You've been ripped off." And he said, "Let's see." And I should point out, this is back in the days before computer viruses. And so we took this disc, we put it into the computer, and sure enough, it's all bells and whistles, Moscow Registration Chamber database. But the best part, though, is we popped the disc out, and there's a telephone number on the disc to call for other databases. And so we called the telephone number, we got the Customs Committee database, we got the Federal Securities Commission database, we got all the other databases. And by the way, Vadim did get ripped off because the other ones only cost $1. So we get the other databases, and then we cross-reference the allegations that we've heard in the lunches and dinners to the data on the databases, and we discovered the most shocking economic statistic I've ever seen in my entire life. And that is that between 1996 and 1999, 9 members of Gazprom management team had stolen oil and gas reserves equal to the size of Kuwait out of Gazprom. Now, remember, there was a war fought over oil and gas reserves the size of Kuwait in Kuwait. It was called the First Gulf War. We've just discovered that a similar crime has occurred and nobody knew it. So that's the first most important economic statistic I've ever seen in my life. The second most important economic statistic I've ever seen in my life is that oil and gas reserves the size of Kuwait only represented 9.65% of Gazprom's total reserves. In other words, more than 90% of Gazprom's reserves had not been stolen. Now, remember, Gazprom was trading at a 99.7% discount because everybody thought everything had been stolen. And I've just proven, based on real analysis and real facts, that more than 90% is still there. Now, in the investment world, that's like the nirvana of the investment world, when you can find a situation where people have so mispriced something that the general impressions of the market are so completely wrong. And so, what do you do in a situation like that? Well, to use a highly technical financial term, we backed up the truck and bought as much Gazprom as we could possibly get. And so it became my single largest investment by far. And that's usually, as an investor, where you stop. You come up with a hypothesis, you test your hypothesis, it turns out to be right, you then buy the shares, and then you wait for the rest of the world to figure out what you figured out. That's normally where you stop. But I was too impatient to wait for the rest of the world to figure it out. And so what I did was I took this analysis that we had done, and I broke it into 7 chapters, the analysis of the stealing. And I shared the first chapter with the Financial Times, the next one with the Wall Street Journal, the next one with the New York Times, the next one with Business Week. And each of them then wrote stories about the stealing at Gazprom. On the back of their stories, then the Russian press picked it up and wrote more stories. On the back of the Russian press's stories, the Russian Duma, the State Duma, the Parliament of Russia, began debates on whether it was a good thing or bad thing for the assets to be stolen out of Gazprom. More stories. Then the management of Gazprom then hired PricewaterhouseCoopers, a famous accounting firm, to write a report to say it was a good thing for the assets to be stolen out of Gazprom. More stories. In the end, there were more than 500 stories written about the theft and corruption at Gazprom based on my report. And then the weirdest thing happened. At the annual general meeting, Vladimir Putin, who is the newly installed president, stepped into the fray, and he fired the CEO of Gazprom, and he replaced him with a new CEO whose job it was not to steal assets. Now, I stress the word assets because he was allowed to steal other stuff. But just the announcement that he wasn't going to steal assets, and the share price jumped 138% that day. And then the share price after that doubled again, and then it doubled again after that. It doubled again after that, and then it doubled again and again and again. And then it doubled again and again. The share price of Gazprom between 1999 and 2005 went up 100 times. And this was my single largest investment. As you can imagine, I was feeling pretty good about myself. And so I said, if I can do this at Gazprom, let's do this at the electricity company. So we did the electricity company. Let's do this at the National Savings Bank. We did it there. Let's do it at some oil companies. Let's do it at the pipeline company. And the strange thing happened, which was that I had this strange alignment of interest with Vladimir Putin. When he had come to power, he was president of Russia, but he really was only the president of the presidential administration of Russia because all the oligarchs were stealing power from him. And the same oligarchs were stealing money from me. And I've never met Vladimir Putin or ever had a conversation with him. But every time I would publicize one of these scandals, Vladimir Putin would step in. And there's this expression, your enemy's enemy is your friend. And so he would step in and he would fire somebody, or he'd replace something, or he would change the charter, or he would issue a presidential decree. And as a result of that, my portfolio went up from $100 million at the bottom of the market to $4.5 billion at the top of the market. And I became the single largest investor in Russia. And I had the perfect job. I was making money for my clients and myself, hand over fist, and I was making the world a better place and getting the bad guys. And it's extremely rare to be able to make money and do good in the same job. You can either make money and not do good, or you can do good and not make money. But to be able to do both in the same job is unprecedented. And I was sitting right in the middle of this thing, and it was just glorious. The problem was that it wasn't going to last forever. And Vladimir Putin wasn't doing any of this stepping in to these situations because he wanted to make Russia a better place. He was stepping into these situations because he wanted to become the biggest oligarch himself. And he decided to go for broke at the end of 2003. He arrested the richest oligarch in Russia, a man named Michael Khodorkovsky, the owner of Yukos. It was the largest oil company in Russia. He arrests Michael Khodorkovsky on his private jet in Siberia. He then takes Khodorkovsky back to Moscow, and he puts him on trial in the summer of 2004 for tax evasion. And I should point out that when you go on trial in a criminal case in Russia, they have a 99.8% conviction rate. And so there's really no presumption of innocence. And as a result, they put you in a cage because that's where you're going to be after the trial is over. And so Michael Khodorkovsky, the richest man in Russia, went to court, sat in the cage, and Vladimir Putin allowed the television cameras to come in the court to film the richest man in Russia sitting in a cage. Now imagine you're the 17th richest man in Russia. You're on your yacht. It's parked off the Hotel du Cap in Antibes. You've just finished up with your mistress in the bedroom. You wander out to the living room. You take the remote, you flick on CNN, and there before you is a guy far smarter, far richer, far more powerful than you, sitting in a cage. What's your natural reaction going to be? You don't want to sit in that cage yourself. And so one by one, the oligarchs returned to Russia in the fall of 2004, and they met with Vladimir Putin, and they said, Vladimir, what do we have to do to make sure we don't sit in a cage? And he said, 50%. Not 50% for the Russian government or 50% for the presidential administration of Russia, 50% for Vladimir Putin. And at that moment in time, Vladimir Putin became the richest man in the world. And at that moment in time, my interests diverged from his. I had carried on with all of my corporate governance, anti-corruption work, but instead of exposing his enemies like I was doing before, I was exposing his own personal financial interests. And it didn't take them very long to go against me. In November of 2005, November 13th, 2005, I'd come to London for a weekend from Moscow, which is where I was living. And on the Sunday night, I flew back to Moscow, November 13th. I arrive at Sheremetyevo Airport. I'm going through the VIP lounge of Sheremetyevo Airport. It's something that should take about 2 minutes to get through. An hour later, I'm still sitting there. They haven't processed my passport. I know something's going on, but I don't know what. And then into the room storms 4 heavily armed border guards who grab me, frog march me down to the basement of the airport, to the detention center of the airport, where they lock me up overnight. I'm sitting there overnight wondering if I'm being arrested or deported. Finally, the next morning, they come and get me. They frog march me back up to another plane. They stick me on an Aeroflot flight. They deport me back to London, and I'm subsequently declared a threat to national security of Russia. Now, this is a pretty harsh sanction for a person who specializes in investing in Russia, and I was the largest foreign investor in Russia. But I also understood that it's hardly a harsh sanction compared to what the Russians normally do. When the Russians turn on you, they tend to do so with extreme prejudice, and being kicked out of a country is hardly a very serious thing. And I said to myself, what could they do which would be more than what they've already done? And the answer is they could arrest my people. I have a lot of people in Moscow, or they could seize the assets of my fund. And so I order my people to, on an emergency evacuation, I get everybody out, and then we sit down and we organize a liquidation of our portfolio as quickly and quietly as we could. And we get everybody out, and we get all of our money out. And it was scary as we were going through the process, but we succeeded. We got everything out. And I thought, phew, that was a scary chapter of my life, but we're done. And so I said, it's time to move on to do other things. And so I set up a new fund to invest in other places. And I thought that was the end of Russia for me. The only thing I kept in Russia was I had an office that I had prepaid the rent for, so I left the office there, and I had one secretary just sit there in case the storm ever blew over. And I got involved in doing other things in other markets around the world. And so I thought I was done with Russia, and I was at a board meeting 18 months later, June 4th, 2007. I was in Paris, and I got a call on my mobile phone from the secretary in the Moscow office, who I never talked to because there's nothing going on there. And she's in a state of panic, and she says, Bill, there's 25 police officers from the Moscow Interior Ministry raiding the office. What should I do? And I said, I don't know. Let me call up our lawyer. I had an American lawyer in Moscow named Jameson Firestone, and I call up Jameson, and I say, Jamie, I just got a call from my secretary. There's 25 police officers in my office. What should I do? I said, I don't know. There's 25 police officers in my office searching for your documents. And so anyway, so the police officers were looking for the stamps, seals, and certificates for our investment holding companies. And they found all those documents at the law firm's office. They seize all those documents. And the next thing we know, we no longer own our investment holding companies. Those companies have been fraudulently re-registered using the documents seized by the police. So at this point, and I should point out that I have no economic risk here. The money is gone. The money is out of the country. But I have a huge amount of legal risk if the police are working, seizing our assets using documents that they've seized in raids. God knows what other things they're going to be doing. And I didn't want to have any, I didn't want to be traveling through Frankfurt Airport one day and getting picked up on an Interpol red notice from Russia. And so I go out and I hire the smartest lawyer I know in Moscow to help me figure it out. And that was a young man named Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei Magnitsky was 35 years old. He worked for an American law firm. He was a specialist in tax. And I hired Sergei to investigate what's going on and to stop it. And so Sergei goes out and investigates what's going on. And he comes back and he says, I figured out what's going on. It's unbelievable. He said, first, there was a two-step process. The first step was they wanted to steal your assets. And he said, however, they failed at that because you got your money out before they got there. And I thought, that's good. He said, however, the second step they did succeed in. And the second step was that when we sold everything the year before, we had $1 billion of profits. And on that $1 billion of profits, we paid to the Russian government $230 million of capital gains tax. And what Sergei had learned through his investigation was that the people who had stolen our companies, they took the companies to the tax authorities of Russia, and they said there was a mistake made in the previous year's tax filing. They said these companies didn't earn $1 billion, they earned zero. And they came up with some forged documents to prove that. And they said because they earned zero, the previous year's $230 million tax payment was paid in error. And they said, therefore, we would like to have the $230 million back. So they applied for a $230 million tax refund, which was the largest tax refund in the history of Russia. They applied for it on the 23rd of December, 2007, 2 days before Christmas. And it was approved and paid out the next day. The largest tax refund in the history of Russia, $230 million. Now, Sergei and I were convinced this must be a rogue operation. There's no way that Putin would have authorized, that this is not my money that's being stolen. This is the government's money that was stolen. Putin would have never authorized the government of Russia's money being stolen by government officials. And we figure if we just put this at the highest level of the Russian government, that the good guys will get the bad guys, and that would be the end of the story. And so we write criminal complaints to every different branch of Russian law enforcement. I go to the TV and radio and newspapers telling the story. And Sergei goes to the Russian State Investigative Committee, their equivalent of the US FBI, and he gives sworn testimony against the police officers who were involved in the raid, who seized the documents. And then he comes back, and we sit down, and we wait for the good guys to get the bad guys. Well, it turns out that in Putin's Russia, there are no good guys. 5 weeks after Sergei testified against the police officers who conducted the raid to seize the documents used in the fraud, 5 weeks later, those same police officers came to Sergei's home on the 24th of November 2008 and arrested him and put him in pretrial detention, where he was then tortured to withdraw his testimony. They put Sergei in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put Sergei in cells with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put Sergei in cells with no toilet, where just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. They'd move him from cell to cell to cell in the middle of the night. They moved him 28 times in his 358 days in detention. And the purpose of all this was to get him to withdraw his testimony against the police officers, and they wanted him to sign a false confession to say that he stole the $230 million, and he did so on my instruction. And Sergei Magnitsky looked like a fairly easy guy to intimidate. He was a tax lawyer. He wore a suit and tie and into his office and bought Starbucks in the morning and went to his cubicle in a nice fancy American law firm. And they figured that here's a guy who'll buckle in a week. But they totally mischaracterized Sergei in their own minds, because Sergei had this unbelievable integrity. He had a will of steel, and for him, the idea of perjuring himself and bearing false witness was much more horrifying than any of the physical pain they were inflicting on him. And he absolutely refused to sign their false confession. And as a result, the pressure got greater and greater and greater. The torture got worse and worse and worse. And after about 6 months of this, his health started to break down. He started getting terrible pains in his stomach. He lost 20 kilos. He went to the doctor, and in the prison hospital, and they diagnosed him as having pancreatitis and gallstones, where he needed an operation. And the operation was scheduled for the 1st of August 2009. About a week before the operation, the officials came to him again and again asked him to sign a false confession. And again he refused. And in retaliation, the officials then moved him from a prison that had a medical wing to a maximum security prison in Moscow called Butyrka, which is considered to be one of the worst prisons in Russia. And most significantly for Sergei, there was no medical facilities at Butyrka. And at Butyrka, Sergei's health completely broke down. He went into a terrible downward spiral. He went into ear-piercing, constant, agonizing pain, and they refused him medical attention. He and his lawyers wrote desperate requests. They wrote 20 different desperate requests for medical attention to every different branch of the criminal justice system. And every one of their requests was either ignored or a number of them were denied in writing. And eventually, on the night of November 16, 2009, Sergei's body could no longer tolerate it, and he went into critical condition. On that night, the Butyrka authorities didn't want to have responsibility for him anymore, and so they put him in an ambulance to send him to a different prison with a medical wing. But when he arrived at the different prison, instead of putting him in the emergency room, they put him in an isolation cell, they chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons came into that cell and beat Sergei Magnitsky to death. That was November 16th, 2009. Sergei Magnitsky was 37 years old. He left a wife and 2 children. I got the news the next morning at 7:45 a.m. here in London, and it was the most horrifying, shocking, traumatic, life-changing news I could have ever gotten. Sergei Magnitsky was killed because he was my lawyer. if Sergei Magnitsky hadn't been my lawyer, he would still be alive. And so when I was finally able to get enough clarity after the hysteria of the news, it was obvious that I had only one choice in my life, which was to put aside everything else I was doing and devote all of my time, all of my resources, and all of my energies to go after the people who killed him and make sure they face justice. And on that day, I made a vow to his memory, to his family, and to myself that I wasn't going to stop until every single one of those people faced justice. And for the last 8.5 years, that's what I've been doing. Now, there's something quite unique about Sergei's case, which is that everybody has their own way of dealing with the adversity of this type of situation, but Sergei's way was to write it all down. He wrote it down in the form of 450 complaints that he wrote during his 358 days in detention, documenting who did what to him, where, how, when, and why. He'd file these complaints, he'd write them up, and once a month he'd hand a stack of complaints to his lawyer. His lawyer would file them. They would be ignored or rejected. But we got copies of all these complaints. And because we have copies of all these complaints, we had the most well-documented, granular, detailed record of human rights abuse that's come out of Russia in the last 35 years. And because of that, I figured the authorities would have to prosecute some of the people who were responsible for his torture and murder. And so we began this campaign inside Russia. I hoped that we were going to get some kind of justice inside of Russia. But I was very sorely mistaken. Putin personally got involved. They circled the wagons, and Putin exonerated every single person who played a role in his false arrest, torture, and death. And moreover, Putin gave promotions and state honors to some of the people who were most complicit. And in the most shocking miscarriage of justice, 3 years after the Russian government murdered Sergei Magnitsky, they put him on trial in the first ever trial against a dead man in the history of Russia. And they put me on trial as his co-defendant. They found us both guilty. They couldn't do anything more to him than killing him. They sentenced me to 9 years in prison in absentia. It became obvious that we were never going to get any kind of justice in Russia. And so I said, if we can't get justice in Russia, let's get justice outside of Russia. But how do you get justice outside of Russia for a torture and murder that's taken place in Russia? There are effectively no legal mechanisms to do that. And I wasn't willing to accept that people are just going to get away with murder of Sergei Magnitsky. And I said, if there's no mechanisms, if there's no laws that we can use to go after these people, then let's create our own law. And that's when I came up with this idea, which was that this was not a crime of ideology or a crime of religion. This was a crime of money. This was a crime of $230 million. The people who stole that $230 million don't keep that money in Russia. They keep that money in the West. They keep that money in U.S. banks. They buy properties in Belgrave Square in London. They send their kids to boarding schools in Switzerland and the UK. They send their girlfriends on shopping trips to Milan. These people travel to the West and keep their money in the West. And so I came up with this idea of freezing their assets and banning their visas. And I took this idea first to Washington. And I met with a Democratic senator named Benjamin Cardin from Maryland and a Republican senator, John McCain from Arizona. And I told them the story of Sergei Magnitsky, the same story I've shared with you. And I said, can we ban their visas and freeze their assets? And these two senators said yes. And in October of 2010, they introduced into Congress the Sergei Magnitsky Act, which freezes assets and bans visas of the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky. And the moment after they introduced it, their phones started ringing from other victims in Russia. And those people called up and said, you found the Achilles heel of the Putin regime. Can you possibly ban the people who killed my brother, my father, my sister, my cousin? And the phones kept on ringing. And after about a dozen of these calls, I got a call from Senator Cardin, who said, how would you feel about widening this so it affects all human rights abusers in Russia? And I said, I can't think of a more beautiful way of honoring Sergei's memory than to create a law in his name that does that. And so they added 65 words to the law to include all other gross human rights abusers in Russia. And then then all sorts of other victims fanned out across Capitol Hill. This thing went viral, and it went for a vote in November of 2012, and it passed the Senate 92-4. It then passed the House of Representatives with 89%. And on December 14, 2012, President Obama signed the Sergei Magnitsky Act into law. And there are now 49 people on the Magnitsky list who were involved in the false arrest, torture, and murder of Sergei Magnitsky. And then afterwards, Putin, he went crazy. Putin went absolutely crazy. And his retaliation against the Magnitsky Act was to ban the adoption of Russian orphans by American families. I should point out that the orphans that were being put up for adoption were not the healthy ones. The Russians put up the sick orphans, the ones with HIV, with Down syndrome, with spina bifida, various other ailments. And Americans came with open arms and open hearts to take these children who wouldn't otherwise survive in the Russian orphanages. These children would die in Russian orphanages. And the Americans had the resources and the ability and the warmth to bring these children back and save these children's lives. And Putin, in retaliation to the Magnitsky Act, banned the adoption of these orphans by American families, sentencing his own sick orphans to death in order to protect his own corrupt officials. He went crazy. He subsequently declared repealing the Magnitsky Act his single largest foreign policy priority. And they went after every way possible to try to repeal the Magnitsky Act. And the most famous initiative was one that most of you have probably heard of, which was on June 9th, 2016, the Russians, Vladimir Putin, sent a lawyer to Trump Tower to meet with Donald Trump Jr., Paul Manafort, and Jared Kushner with one specific ask, which was to repeal the Magnitsky Act. He's gone crazy because he understood that this was effectively ruining his whole modus operandi. And moreover, he felt, rightly, that we were going to go after his own money. And he knew that, and we have subsequently figured that out because we discovered that some of the $230 million that was stolen went to Vladimir Putin. We found out through a combination of investigation from the Panama Papers and other details and documents that we've gotten, that a famous cellist who came out in the Panama Papers as being worth $2 billion, a Russian cellist, who turns out to be Putin's best childhood friend and the godfather of Putin's daughter, and a nominee for Vladimir Putin, got some of this money. Sergei Roldugin got some of this money. And so Vladimir Putin rightly understands that his money is exposed by the Magnitsky Act. And he rightly understands that, and he has a lot of money. I estimate that over the course of his 18 years in power, he's accumulated a $200 billion fortune. And so his entire raison d'etre, which is to commit terrible crimes in Russia and then keep that money in the West, has been put at risk because of this piece of legislation. Well, Vladimir Putin has not succeeded in repealing the Magnitsky Act. The Magnitsky Act now exists in 7 countries. After the United States, we've got it in Canada, we've got it in Estonia, we've got it in Latvia, we've got it in Lithuania. We have it here. As of last week, the sanctions bill has been upgraded with all Magnitsky amendments to make it fully Magnitsky compliant with America and Canada. And I've got 7 other countries that we're going to this year. Sweden, Denmark, Holland, France, Ukraine, South Africa, and Australia are all in their parliaments in some place. We have Magnitsky legislation moving forward. I'm never going to be able to bring Sergei Magnitsky back, and that's a burden, a terrible burden that I'm going to have to bear with me for the rest of my life. But I have been able to make sure that his death wasn't a meaningless death, that he has a legacy, and that legacy is to create consequences for bad guys all over the world. And I should point out that the Magnitsky Act now applies globally. It doesn't just apply to Russia. If you're a bad guy in China, if you're a bad guy in Venezuela, if you're a bad guy in Angola, you are eligible to be sanctioned under the Magnitsky Act in all these countries. And I'm hoping that by creating consequences, real consequences that these people care about, that maybe some of them will not kill, not torture, not maim like they did to Sergei Magnitsky. And that's a good legacy for Sergei Magnitsky. And And I'm very much hoping that through his death, lives will be saved. Thank you very much.
I mean, it's an incredible story. If you want to sort of ponder on this at a slower pace, then you should read Bill's book, because he's written a truly remarkable account of this whole terrible episode and the build up to it, because it's important that we see the journey from the man at 31 who was making so much money to a man who then became seized with a different kind of passion. And that's the thing that is so interesting for me, is the way in which you've put the sense of responsibility that you feel and the sense of horror at the injustice of what happened to Sergei, that you've actually put it to use to create change. And that it's moved beyond the particular of the Magnitsky case to a much more general thing which human rights lawyers can use across the board. I just wanted to mention one or two things. I mean, what's happened to his family now?
Well, the Russians started, when they put him on trial, when he was dead, they had to have somebody represent him. And so they tried to get his family to sit in the defendant's chair.
Oh, God.
And so that was the point at which we evacuated the family. They're here in London.
Yes, I've met his wife.
His wife works with us on the Magnitsky campaign, and his son is about to go to university, and he's a good boy and a smart fellow, and hopefully very much like his father. And they're fine, thank God.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that I wanted to ask you really about was about Khodorkovsky. I mean, he was the man who was put in the cage, and the lesson was to go to everybody about how, you know, if you were to cross Putin, then you were going to be dealt with. Khodorkovsky was released after 10 years in prison. And again, with you, I've met Khodorkovsky. I just wanted to know what made Putin decide to release him rather than to keep him incarcerated.
So Putin is a short-term tactician, not a long-term strategist. And so Khodorkovsky had been in prison for 5 years first, and then they convicted him a second time for a second 5 years. And each time they convicted him, it became more obvious, more illegitimate, and more political. And he was just about to launch the Russian Winter Olympics when Khodorkovsky was due to be released. And so Putin made a very short-term tactical decision, which was that it would have looked really bad at that moment in time when he was trying to look good.
He was starting a third episode
right.
of
And so he decided that he was going to, and so he let him out of jail after 9 years and 4 months. And by the way, no one, if you're sentenced to 10 years, you normally spend like 5 or 6 years in jail. And so, but everybody was like cheering Putin, like what a liberal guy he is to let Khodorkovsky out of jail after 9 years and 4 months. And I had all sorts of people calling me up saying, wow, Putin has really changed. This is really great. And I said, no, he hasn't. He's a complete monster. But that's why he let him out of jail, is purely because of the Olympics. And the same thing with Pussy Riot.
Yes, that's right. He let them out too. I mean, one of the things that is said, a charge that's made against you, is that you were pally with Putin before the falling out or the parting of the ways. When were you? I mean, obviously at a distance. You've said that you've never met him, but that you were somebody who didn't speak ill of Putin when he was first in power.
Well, more than that, I was actually a supporter of Putin during his first term in power, and so. Obviously, I was wrong, but I won't try to revise history. Why did I? So when he first came to power, it was at the time when Yeltsin was just finishing, and Yeltsin's power was this. It was this total chaos under the Yeltsin regime. 22 oligarchs ended up owning 40% of the country, and everybody else was in destitute poverty. And so as a result of this destitute poverty, professors were taxi drivers, nurses became prostitutes, art museums were selling the paintings off the wall. It was just chaos and horribleness. and everybody, not just me, but everybody wanted some order. And so, and by the way, they tried 4 different prime ministers before they got, or 3 different prime ministers, and Putin was the 4th prime minister candidate because Yeltsin wanted to have somebody to appoint as a prime minister who could become president, and who had two features, was capable of becoming president and staying president, and who could pardon Yeltsin the day after he becomes president and stay president to keep that pardon. And so they picked Putin as the 4th choice. Putin comes in, and Putin has this great advantage, which is that he's sober, and Yeltsin was always drunk. He was a lean, sort of technocratic-looking guy, and his main asset is this face which shows nothing. And so everybody looks at his face and assumes something. And so you take whatever your hopes are and you put it into this face because there was nothing there. And so I took this idea, which is that he's this sort of technocratic guy who's just going to bring order to the country, and that's what he claimed he was going to do. And he kind of did, if you actually look at because he was not really confident in his first couple of years as president. He did tax reform, he did administrative reform, got rid of lots of stuff, and it all kind of looked good. The market was going up, he was crushing the oligarchs.
But he also seemed to be your good guy, because whenever you would expose bad things, he then kind of seemed to come in.
He was my perfect good guy, and so I thought, great guy.
So you thought you were pulling his strings?
I didn't think I was pulling his strings, but I thought, here, this is all going to turn into like just some boring, middle-income European country where everything is going to be good, and the value of my investments is going to skyrocket as everything normalizes. And I was I couldn't have been more wrong. I mean, he's turned out to be the biggest monster of the world, and as good as I am at predicting stocks going up, I wasn't good at predicting what Vladimir Putin was going to end up with.
Who would like to ask Bill a question? I see hands going up, right, okay. Here, please.
Thank you. Interestingly, I too worked in Russia for some time. I too was funded when I first went by George Soros. He didn't give me as much money as he gave you. But I wasn't working in financial investment. I was working in trying to build civic society, and in what some people called the master plan of the mind, which I did not like. But I saw a very different Russia. I saw poor people who had their vouchers that Yeltsin so stupidly gave them, and you've talked about that, stolen from them basically for maybe $10 because they were so desperate. I still know that the people of Russia, the ordinary people of Russia, are very, very poor. And I think we don't reflect enough on what happened when the West, when Americans went into Russia in the 1990s. I remember being in a lift in Perm, which is the center of gas and oil and Lukoil and Gazprom and what have you. I was in a lift going down for my breakfast in my slippers and with my coat over me because it was a very, very cold hotel. And the guys in the lift presumed that as far east as this and in this society there was not a woman who could speak English in the lift. So these American guys coming to invest in oil in Perm were very free in in how they spoke about what they were doing and how they were doing it. And I must admit, I felt ill. I'm not the quietest of people, and I did feel very angry, but felt that I was completely out of my depth in challenging them. But when I did get out of the lift, I made very sure they understood that I had understood everything that they'd said. So I do think we've got an enormous responsibility for what's going on in Russia now. I do think we need to reflect very much on that and how the ordinary people of Russia, we had some people around last night, teachers from across Russia, and they were actually not critical of Putin. They were more critical, in fact, of Medvedev, who apparently recently has said, when they talked about having their salaries increased, actually told them to go out and do business and perhaps they should sell flowers. And that sort of Russia is a legacy we've all got to take some responsibility for. Now, your story is horrendous, but what about the millions and millions of stories across Russia where people have had pittances from out of the oil industry or the gas industry or diamonds or uranium or whatever it is, the industries that they've worked in, stolen from them? I watched those people on the street during the early 90s in Perm trying to get money to feed their families. So whilst that's horrendous, and we all jump up and down about Russia and about Putin and what have you, let's remember and reflect on all of those people who made millions and billions out of the poorest Russian people. And let's remember that many of those people are still in the same circumstances today as they were whenever the wall came down and communism ended. Thank you. But can you please respond to that in terms of the effect that, and what we can do now?
Didn't we introduce a kind of a sort of mad form of capitalism into Russia? Didn't we? I mean, wasn't there a way in which, in saying, you know, we're lifting the weight of communism from the shoulders of Russian people, that somehow we didn't in any way talk about pluralism or talking about doing, you know, a move towards a society that might be, you know, become less like the Wild West. I mean, the business is if there are vacuums, you know, bad stuff almost invariably goes in.
Well, so first of all, we didn't introduce anything. Okay, the Russians, Boris Yeltsin introduced this.
Sure.
Okay,
but with our encouragement.
Encouragement or non-encouragement, so we can't bear responsibility for what they did. We might have had, you know, there might have been people on the margins who made some decisions. We were not running that country. The people who did the crimes are 98% Russians. And coming back to your point, I completely agree with you. Everybody is in destitute poverty in that country, other than 1,000 people, and those 1,000 people are the people around Vladimir Putin, who have stolen $1 trillion. And if you go into the center of London or you go to the south of France, all the money that should have been in the pockets of those people, should have been paying for their medicine, paying for their teachers, paying for the roads, are in villas and bank accounts in Switzerland. It's not the Westerners who did this. It's a group of small group of Russians who've done this. And for you to say that Vladimir Putin is not responsible, it doesn't reflect reality. Vladimir Putin is the richest man among this group. He's stolen from his people in amounts that are unfathomable by anybody in the West. And you might have been offended by Americans, and Americans are offensive people in running around Russia, but it's not their fault. It was the fault of the oligarchs, and then it was the fault of Putin's KGB oligarchs who have stolen from all these people that are so in terrible destitution right now. And he's continuing to steal from them. He's continuing to steal from them and making it worse and worse and worse. The worse the Russian economy gets, the more he starts wars outside of Russia, the more he starts repressing people in Russia, and it's a terrible, terrible situation.
I saw other hands. Pavlos. Pavlos is one of our law professors.
Thank you. I haven't read your book, but I've read Masageshin's book, The Man Without a Face, about Putin, and Karen Darwish's book on Putin's kleptocracy, I think. But I still find Putin a mystery. I mean, I don't doubt that he is responsible for all these deaths and for the massive corruption. But what do you think motivates him? I mean, if you have all this money, I mean, I don't know. I mean, he's tied up in trust, friends, who knows where the money is. But why would anyone want $200 billion? I mean, he's also
you're
associated...
speaking like a man who doesn't have $200 billion.
I mean, he's also associated with this kind of mystical fascist doctrines, Ilyun and Dugin and these other theorists and this far-right nationalism. Is it true, or is it just another face that he puts on because it's convenient? So could you just comment a little bit on Putin the man? I mean, what he's doing, I really believe what you say, that what he's doing is truly monstrous, and it's difficult for us in the West to understand how monstrous it is. But who is this man and why is he doing this?
So, this gentleman referred to a woman by the name of Karen Dawisha, who since has recently passed away, but she was the sort of leading scholar on Putin's corruption. And she wrote a book called Putin's Kleptocracy. And for anyone interested in Russia and this type of stuff, you should read her book because it's definitive. Putin is a kleptocrat first and foremost. And it started a long time before he was president, and he became, and coming to your question, why does anyone need any of this money? The one thing I can tell you, because I've dealt with a lot of wealthy people in my business career, the wealthier people get, it becomes an obsessive compulsive disorder, where the more money they have, the more money they want. And Putin became wealthy as president, and then wanted more, and more, and more, and more, and more. And eventually he created a situation where he's taken so much money that stuff doesn't work anymore in Russia, because the money that he's got should have been money that was spent on social services and people and government, the stuff the government is supposed to provide people. And it created a terrible situation, because I would say that Putin's main objective is wealth accumulation. But as his wealth has accumulated, he can't keep any of that money in his own name, by the way. The money has to be held by other people, because any piece of paper that shows Vladimir Putin's name on a bank account is basically
a basis for blackmail, yeah.
And he would use that blackmail on others. They could use it on him. And so everybody who holds his money for him are what I call oligarch trustees, where there's just a handshake. So it creates an even worse problem. So here he's got $200 billion. It's all being held by guys on the basis of a handshake in a world where nobody trusts anybody and they can't be trusted. And so how does he trust them? He can only trust them if he's in power to be able to arrest them, kill them, or destroy their lives.
I know, but isn't the money a bulwark for the thing that really is of interest to him, which is power? I would have thought that the power is the thing that is the aphrodisiac, the potent thing for him. And it's supported by the fact that the more money that you have, then the less likely your power is to be taken from you. You're more secure in your power.
Well, so first of all, it's even more extreme than that, because the moment he's out of power, he also loses his money. Because so what happens the day that Putin says, I want to retire, I'm going to run the Putin Presidential Library, give speeches, that's the moment when he calls up Vladimir and says, Vladimir, can you wire over $2 billion that you're holding for me? And Vladimir says, Vladimir, who?
What?
And hangs up the phone. And then worse, Putin gets arrested for all the crimes that he's committed. And then he goes to jail, and then maybe something terrible happens to him in jail. And so Putin, in order for him to keep his money, he has to keep his power. And in order for him to stay alive, he's got to keep his power. And so he's never going to leave.
What about his position with regard to the things like his hostility to the European Union, to NATO, his business over Ukraine and Crimea? What's all that? Is that not about a sort of the KGB piece of the man who still hankers for the old wider empire of Russia?
I think it comes back to this whole thing of the man, this man who's got to stay in power. So he's got to stay in power. And how do you stay in power when you're stealing from everybody and everyone is doing has bad life? Everybody has an economic situation which is not good because you've stolen all the money, that you can't get treated at the hospital properly. How do you stay in power? You stay in power by starting wars. You stay in power by creating foreign enemies. You stay in power by repressing people in your own country. And so the Ukrainian conflict, which is a prime example of this.
But we're hearing about teachers coming to visit in the UK and thinking Putin is really a rather good guy and that he's got their interests at heart, and they're blaming somebody else, his prime minister, for their failings. And still imagining that Putin is the answer to a maiden's prayer.
Well, so Putin controls every different form of communication in Russia. Television, radio, newspapers, and even the internet. The internet they don't control, although they're starting to control it, but they just bombard it with so much stuff you don't know if anything's true. And so basically, if you're told 24 hours a day a lie about that Putin is this incredible person who's almost godlike,
And who's got your interests at
and
heart.
he's got your interests at heart. And by the way, there's all these other pieces of information floating around about the good czar and the bad boyar. That's how it's done. And but the Ukrainian conflict is a perfect example where they ran a propaganda campaign for a month straight, basically saying that the Ukrainians were Nazis and fascists, that they were going to kill Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine, and Russia, in order to protect these Russian-speaking people against these fascists, they're going to have to do a humanitarian military exercise. And the Ukrainians are not Nazis or fascists. They're probably, of any country, they probably have more in common with the Russians than anybody. They created a fake enemy in order to create a war, in order to have a nationalist fervor, and that's what the Ukrainian conflict is all about.
Who would like to come in? Yes, Mary Arden, Dame Mary Arden, one of our great judges.
I would like just to try and turn the conversation just a little bit to ask you a question.
Mary,
Which
there's a...
wasn't clear. It's a different sort of question, different line, not only to the personality of Putin. But when you said that you couldn't think of any remedy when Sergei Magnitsky was killed, did you not think that possibly a case could have been mounted in the European Court of Human Rights? And there are many cases from Russia there. The difficulty, one of the difficulties the court is facing is that Russia is quite opposed to the court and has withdrawn its substantial financial contribution. But the court is there and sitting impartially to hear cases about, for instance, the right to life and the non-investigation of cases like this.
That's a great question, and we did indeed take a case to the European Court of Human Rights. We filed an application for the violation of his right to life and torture and various other things in 2010. We are in 2018 now. There's an expression that delayed justice is not justice. And furthermore, with all, I don't know what your relationship is with the European Court, but it's not a really appropriate, I mean, it's better than nothing, but what happens, so let's say we're going to win our case decisively at the European Court for Human Rights. And this is, when I say we, I mean the family of Sergei Magnitsky. What do they get? They get a judgment against the Russian Federation, not against any individual, against the Russian Federation, in which some harsh things will be written in the judgment saying how badly they treated Sergei Magnitsky, and the family gets 50,000 euros. That's far from the kind of justice that would satisfy me, and far from the justice that would satisfy his family.
And also very often Russia doesn't actually follow through on the judgments that are made against them in the European Court.
And then on top of that, so you're right, that there are other mechanisms. Then there's the International Criminal Court. And I went to the head of the International Criminal Court who I met, and I said, can we do something about this? And he said, well, once they kill 100,000 people, you can bring the case to me. And then I went. I became friendly with a former UN war crimes prosecutor, a man named David Crane, who is a professor of law, was until very recently at the Syracuse University Law School, and he ran something called Impunity Watch. And I went to David Crane, and I said, what about universal jurisdiction? There's this concept called universal jurisdiction, where if a crime is so horrific, you can prosecute it in the UK for something that took place in Russia. And so he had his law school class basically analyze every country that had universal jurisdiction to see whether we could possibly bring a case against the people who tortured and killed Sergei Magnitsky in some country using universal jurisdiction. And the law school class's analysis and answer was no. And so for all intents and purposes, there is no such thing as international justice in a situation like this other than the European Court for Human Rights, which I don't consider satisfactory justice.
One of the problems, I mean, you were helped by Sergei himself because of, as you said, of the incredible care with which he sent messaging to his lawyers about the complaints he was making, about the things that happened to him, and naming names of the people who had done things to him over the months of his imprisonment. And that helped to create a list of people who should be targeted for sanctions of one kind or another. And that's rare, isn't it? I mean, that's going to be one of the problems about Magnitsky, the act, isn't it? Yeah. Is that, I mean, recently the Americans have created a list in response to the allegations of Russia's, well, they actually did it in response to the poisoning thing here in Britain. They too responded, and they did it by creating a sanctions list against a whole set of oligarchs, including Deripaska and all sorts of people. What was the evidential? How do you reach the evidential standard on deciding who to put on a list?
So the evidential standard is quite high, actually. It's not easy to get someone on the Magnitsky list. I've spent, since 2012, we've gotten 49 people sanctioned, and I've proposed 282 people to the U.S. government. The definition is pretty straightforward. It's gross human rights abuses, and now it's also high gross corruption. And you have to come up with documentary evidence that would hold up in a court in order to get somebody sanctioned. And it has to be defended in a court because you're taking away people's property rights. Nobody has a right to travel anywhere, but nobody has it's a privilege, not a right to get a visa to the UK or the US or whatever. But if you have property, that is your right, and a court, and you have to have the right to adjudicate that if they take that away from you. And so anybody who puts somebody on a sanctions list. But coming back to your point about the, it's hard to find the evidence. It's probably true in many cases. However, there are so many atrocities in the world that some of them there is quite a bit of evidence. And what's happened is now, so the Magnitsky Act was passed in 2012, and there's now a global Magnitsky Act, which applied in the United States, which was passed in 2016. And it has created an absolute flood, a true flood of victims from everywhere coming forward to say, we come from we come from Tibet. Here are some people. We come from Venezuela. We come from Bahrain. We come from it's Turkey. There's so this piece of legislation has given everybody some, because there has not been any other mechanism for international justice. This is like there's a huge pent-up demand of shocking and horrific cases where people now can at least demand some. It's not justice in any real sense, but at least it's something.
A last question. Yes, the gentleman up there had his hand up for quite a while.
Are you, in spite of the recent Skripal affair, more comfortable about your personal safety than you were 3 or 4 years ago?
I've been in an unsafe situation since this whole fight with Putin has started. I don't think it's gotten more unsafe or less unsafe. I think this is a pretty unsafe country to live in when you're fighting with Putin because the government doesn't. In Litvinenko, they created no consequences, and we're still in a wait and see mode to see whether after Skripal, whether they so far have expelled 23 diplomats. I don't think the Russians care about 23 diplomats. They do care about the 7 oligarchs who got sanctioned by the United States. That's been devastating. And so I've been telling everybody that who's listened in Parliament, and Helena.
And we know who they are.
Yeah.
We know who they are, and we know where they live. We've got their addresses.
And I'm saying that this government has to sanction at the same level as the United States these people, unless they want more chemical weapons attacks here. But as far as my own personal safety goes, they're after me. They've tried, and it's not just murder. They're suing me. There was
also the man who gave you information, who was found dead in strange circumstances after a run in.
Yeah, there was a guy named Alexander Parapolichny. Some of you will recognize that name.
His surname was one that I wanted to avoid trying to say.
He came to us. He was a member of the criminal group that stole the $230 million. He fell out with his co-conspirators, and he came. And they were coming after him. He came to London and he gave us the dossier on where they kept their money, and we went to the Swiss authorities and they froze their money in Switzerland, and then he died jogging outside his house 2 years later. And the Surrey police refused to acknowledge it as a suspicious death. And so things like that don't help the rest of us when the police don't allow people to get away with murder.
I'm going to draw this to a close, but I hope that you will understand why I started this event tonight by saying that Bill Browder has been heroic in what he's been doing. And over these years since the death of your lawyer, you've been absolutely fierce in your pursuit of justice, and I pay tribute to you, and I want you to join me in thanking him for talking to us tonight. Can I tell you all that Bill's book is really fascinating, and it's going to become a film. And so read it before you see the movie. But that's one of the things that he's been involved in recently, is that it's definitely going to at some point hit the screens. We're just having to decide who should play him in the movie. So anyway, but I just wanted you to know that the book is wonderful. Do try and get hold of it. Thank you. Great. Bill, that was great. Really great.
Just shake a hand at my hero.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, isn't that amazing what he's done?
Thank you very
A
much.
fellow American.
I was locked on a think tank
Okay.
in Moscow,
Oh, wow.
and I didn't realize